Welcome to this week's episode of the Readout LOUD, a weekly biotech podcast from STAT. I'm Allison DeAngelis.
I'm Adam Feuerstein.
And I'm Damian Garde.
It's Thursday, August 3rd, and here's what we're going to talk about this week.
All is not well in the world of biotech startups. We'll talk about some recent layoffs, a reverse merger, and what it means for the sector in 2023.
We'll also discuss the latest news in the life sciences, including a dramatic saga in ocular medicine, the volatile business of COVID-19, and some major milestones in gene therapy.
All that after a word from our sponsor.
Hey there, my name is Nicholas St. Fleur. I'm a science reporter here at STAT, and I host our health equity podcast called Color Code. Our second season started airing this spring, and in it, we're taking things local, to my hometown of Long Island. Where you live has a huge impact on your health, and Long Island is a microcosm of racial health disparities that exist in suburbs across the country. We've spoken to families and to advocates about how they grapple with issues like environmental racism, segregation, and food deserts. We've heard from scientists and researchers about how redlining of the suburbs continues to create health disparities seen today. And I've explored the ways that racism has impacted my own childhood growing up here. Episodes air every other week through the rest of the summer. Racism in medicine is a national emergency. Together, let's raise the alarm.
So I guess, I don't know where we should introduce Allison. Welcome back to the podcast. Here you are.
I'm here. Thank you. It's good to be back. And Meg certainly leaves big shoes to fill. Last week's episode was really touching for someone who has listened to the podcast for a while and has kind of listened to Meg. But it's fun to be back.
We are happy to have you back. As most of our listeners know, you were here before, filling in for Meg, actually, when she was on maternity leave. So it's nice to have you back. And maybe let's get started with a story that's in your wheelhouse, and that is some layoffs and some trouble at a startup called Celsius Therapeutics.
Yeah, so this morning we reported that, so Celsius, which is this company that was launched in 2018 by Third Rock Ventures with a focus on like immunology and single cell RNA sequencing to kind of find new, avenues into like why certain patients responded to certain drugs and why some didn't. Celsius announced they kind of had an odd double announcement this week. They started their first clinical trial, but to do so, to fund that trial, they had to lay off about 75% of their staff. I spoke to the CEO, Tarek, yesterday, and it was a really interesting conversation. Clearly, like, it's this very bittersweet, very, like, conflicted moment for him to have to, like, announcing, like, what is a big milestone for a startup to start a clinical trial, but then also acknowledging that they had to lay off a lot of companies, or a lot of employees, I should say, to do that. But it's something that I think a lot of biotechs are really thinking about these days as this market downturn continues, and we really, are looking for an end in sight.
Yeah, I thought this story was kind of a fascinating case study of sort of how things have transpired over the last few years, which is to say, one, as you mentioned, layoffs in biotech have become more commonplace. But for Celsius in particular, as you mentioned, it kind of launched very much in the mode of the biotech startup of a few years ago, where it's like, we have this platform, we have this proprietary approach to science, and it's going to lead to X drug and Y drug, and the future is so bright, to now when the financial realities, even opposite or leaving aside whatever data they may have, the financial realities of biotech have changed. Suddenly it ceases to be a platform story. And it's like, well, actually, we have this one thing that we think could be a good drug. It targets a specific biological target for a specific disease, in this case, inflammatory bowel disease. And we're moving into phase 1. And so it becomes very like down to brass tacks biotech. And so nothing about Celsius fundamentally changed, although, as you wrote, they have excise some of their pipeline, and obviously they're laying off some staff, but like it is functionally the same company, but the way it's discussing its future has gone back to kind of the battled times of, you know, a more staid and more, you know, less financially, I guess, bountiful biotech era. So it's just kind of interesting to watch that unfold. Both, you know, we've seen it happening consistently over the past couple of years, but all contained within this one company, kind of living through this story.
Oh, yeah. Celsius was this company that, you know, launched kind of very quickly, you know, within a year or two, had 2 pharma partnerships and a bunch of academic collaborations. And those are all kind of phasing out right now. And as you point out, they've had to really kind of focus on like product. We are this one product company. And it also brought me back. I was talking to Tarek about this. I feel around the time that like Celsius launched, there was this conversation, you know, like they initially were doing, you know, work in oncology. And at the time there was this big kind of, as you say, like platform push to say like, well, we're going to take what we learned from like immuno-oncology and we're going to translate it to inflammatory diseases and autoimmune diseases. And I feel like that conversation has fizzled out. So many of those companies that I remember from that like 2018, 2019 era, I can't recall many off the top of my head that are still kind of taking that 2-prong approach. It's a really marked shift in the startup world. And unfortunately, like Celsius was just one of the companies that announced layoffs this week.
And Allison, tell us a little bit more about the particular instance here. I mean, because in your story, you mentioned that they were going back to some of the VC firms. Mm-hmm. They wanted to raise some more money. And, you know, there's some big name VCs who are backing this company. But, you know, they were basically told, I guess, no, that there wasn't any more money to be had and that they should go public. But yet, obviously, the IPO window was sort of closed, right?
Yeah. Basically, the feedback that, you know, Tarek said that they were getting from investors, and they talked to a bunch of investors, was that, well, look, like you're hoping to raise a Series C, you're about to go into the clinic. This is normally a time where like you should be looking to become a publicly traded company. You know, like this is the time period where you're going to start having like consistent news flow. You know, you're getting more advanced. You should, you know, in a normal quote unquote normal time period, or at least like a pre-2021 time period, you would launch an IPO. You would, you know, file an S1. And though everybody's kind of looking for the IPO window to open up, nobody really wants to be the first one to kind of step forward and do that. The IPO window is pretty closed still. And basically investors were saying, you know, like, you should really be a publicly traded company. We would love to see you do that. But we don't want to, like, invest more money and have it be locked up for who knows how long in, you know, before you guys are able to complete an IPO. So, and then there were conversations that they had with other investors where basically they couldn't come to, you know, an agreement on valuation, which is the very tense conversation I think that everybody in the startup world is having these days. You know, I feel like a year ago, a flat round was kind of the norm. You know, down rounds were kind of still being, you know, fitfully talked about. I get the sense that, you know, in August 2023, down rounds are very much more the conversation. You know, Tarek wouldn't, discuss if that was the case, if that was part of the conversation for Celsius. But I think more broadly in biotech, you just want to be able to raise money, period.
Well, speaking of microcosmic biotech startup things, this is not a great segue. But EQRX, a company we've talked about on this podcast before, launched, or I don't know when they launched, but they announced their existence very buzzily in early 2020 with a plan to basically make new treatments specifically for cancer more cheaply than had been done in the past, and as a result, sell them more affordably and compete with established oncology products on price, which was a novelty. And they went public in 2021, and there was a lot of fanfare there. There is, I mean, we can talk about it later, I'm kind of ellipsing through some regulatory drama that changed the trajectory of EQRX, we can say. And over the past few months, we've witnessed the company basically kind of winding down to oblivion, including laying off staff, much as Celsius did, and pivoting, basically, like abandoning that initial business plan that they had. What we learned this week is that that pivot has found its endpoint in that they have agreed to merge with a company called Revolution Medicines, not really for any scientific or therapeutic purpose. They have about $1 billion in cash. Revolution would like that money, as money is hard to come by, as our previous conversation made clear. And so the deal basically is EQRX being liquidated into another company that happens to, as all three of these firms do, have ties to Third Rock Ventures. And I don't know, Adam, what do you make of this being the end, or the prospective end of the EQRX story?
Yeah, I mean, this was sort of the expected end of EQRX, and the company had already, as you mentioned, Damien, had gone through a lot of struggles. They had a pretty massive layoff earlier this year. So I think this was kind of the expected outcome. I think what's interesting here, a few interesting things here. Obviously, Alexis Barcy was kind of the mastermind and founder of EQRX, so not a good outcome for him. He's also connected to Celsius, Allison, so not a great week for Alexis. But I think, just quickly, I think, what's interesting here is that, they mean, as you mentioned, this $1 billion in cash that EQRX had amassed on its balance sheet, which will now be transferred to Revolution Medicines, which is another Alexis Barcy company. At least he sits on the company's board. I wonder how the other shareholders of EQRX feel about this deal. I mean, I would imagine that maybe some of those shareholders would like to get that $1 billion back, returned to them instead of being transferred over to Revolution Medicines. But I guess we'll see whether that deal closes.
It's a really funny time for investors because a lot of investors are actually still sitting on quite a bit of cash. They've been very kind of sparing over the last year about making new investments. But because there are no IPOs, because, the M&A market isn't maybe as vibrant as we would like to see, their ability to kind of like pull in proceeds and like make disbursements to the outside investors, the limited partners that finance them, I've, been hearing is kind of like that's getting tense. So although like in one hand you could argue that, EQRX should kind of give its money back to those investors so they can at least like, I don't know, do something with it. It's their, their and their clients' money. You have to wonder if there was like a pitch made that was like, okay, well, if we put this into Revolution, it will then be able to, reap rewards. A big bet. We'll see how that one plays out.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Revolution is a developer of cancer drugs. So if Revolution succeeds and uses that money to develop drugs successfully and get them to the market, then I guess those EQRX shareholders who would then now be Revolution shareholders might get their money back in that way. It's a little bit of a convoluted way of getting your money back, but I guess that's the risk you take by investing in biotech.
That was so like a higher level takeaway. Yeah. Adam, let's talk about the thesis of investing in biotech. That's what the rest of the podcast will be.
Well, I mean, actually, kind of on that point, Allison, that you were mentioning this kind of strange moment where, the IPO window is not open to the extent that it was in the past, although I guess it is more open than it was a year ago. And that, the planned or the expected boom in acquisitions has not exactly happened. It's interesting because it kind of creates this almost like valley of death for a certain kind of biotech company where you used to be able to go public on, like, let's say, proof of concept data. That's now more difficult. And while there has been an increase in buyouts relative to the year before, it's mostly a dollar increase. And when you look at the actual deals that are done, they're pretty top heavy, which is to say the numbers are inflated by a few very large deals for companies that have late stage, like proven drugs or even marketed drugs. So if you look at it from like the biotech startup perspective, it's harder to get that crossover funding round that, for example, Celsius would have been seeking, because it's harder to go public. And as a result of it being harder to go public, it's harder to get money to get to the proof of concept stage that you apparently need to get get a pharma company to buy you. So there's this, I don't know how many, but dozens of biotech companies that are kind of now in this little pocket of the business that is like, it's just in a really unfortunate position now when it comes to raising capital. And I guess in a way, well, EQRx didn't really have a pipeline anymore, so maybe that's a bad example, but in a way it kind of exemplifies the difficult decisions that one might have to make based on the macro environment.
Yeah, like Celsius and EQRx are almost inverse examples on like the spectrum of biotech startups right now. Is, Celsius having, a product that they're putting into clinical trials that's in a really interesting market, Boehringer Ingelheim and Roivant, and a few others are developing similar drugs right now. They've got a product, no money. EQRx has still a lot of money, no products. And we need something in the middle. We need more in the middle right now. But I mean, to kind of segue to some kind of exciting product things, this was a kind of banner week in gene therapy. Damien, Adam, who wants to kick off kind of leading us through what's been happening, maybe starting with Sarepta?
That was a very professional segue, Alison. You're back in the swing of things here, so we appreciate
Thank you.
that. So I think as we've talked about in the past on this podcast about one of the sort of the big trends this year and into next year will be the commercial rollout of gene therapies. For a long time we talked about these in a sort of theoretical or a clinical perspective because they were all in studies and they hadn't yet approved. But now we've got a pretty decent amount of gene therapies that are approved on the market, and so we're interested in seeing how well they do commercially as a business and whether they can get patients and insurance companies to pay for these one-time, very expensive therapies. Sarepta Therapeutics, which is just recently received conditional approval or accelerated approval for their gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, reported earnings on Wednesday night, and they, at the same time, simultaneously announced that they had the first patient infused with their gene therapy on a commercial basis. For some, that was a sort of an unexpected or a pleasant surprise because the company had been a little bit more cautious about how long it was going to take to get that first patient. They also said that they've got a handful of other patients who will probably be infused in the next week or two. What's interesting about it, or at least the patient they announced yesterday, or this is Wednesday, was that the patient was 1 day shy of his 6th birthday. And why that is noteworthy is, if you recall, the FDA approved the gene therapy only for 4 and 5-year-old boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. This boy obviously was getting right up against that timeline or that that restriction. So I think that the company really does believe and wants to have a label that is not age restricted. So it's kind of interesting that the first boy infused was almost like 1 day shy of 6, and I imagine that the other boys who will get this therapy soon will also be closer to 6, because obviously I think those parents and clinicians or physicians who treat those boys, they want to get them infused before they sort of quote technically sort of fall off the label.
Wow, what a birthday present.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is quite the birthday present.
And the Sarepta story is kind of interesting in the context of gene therapies more broadly, because, as you mentioned, it has that conditional approval. And the condition is that this gene therapy also meet its goals in a larger randomized phase 3 study. But we will have data from that larger randomized phase 3 study before the end of this year, at least is the expectation, which is to say this conditional approval could end up being kind of an artifact of history if the study is a success, and presumably if it is a success, the FDA expands the approval to a traditional one and makes it available to more boys with Duchenne, larger age group, et cetera. So it's kind of an interesting story to watch, both scientifically, regulatorily, and even in business terms, because what Sarepta is doing, trying to get patients on commercial therapy, I mean, they're kind of spinning multiple plates at the same time because this trial is ongoing. But one thing that maybe provides some context for this and just the broader gene therapy maybe difficulty is too strong a term, but the complicated means of getting patients outside of clinical trials onto these therapies after they are approved. Unicure has a gene therapy for hemophilia B. I think I have here in the notes, Adam, that you prepared, so I'll give you credit for this. I'm just reading it.
A peek behind the curtain.
Yeah. Their first commercial patient was dosed in June for a gene therapy that was approved in November of last year. Likewise, Bluebird, their gene therapy for beta thalassemia was approved in August of 2022, and their first commercial patient was this spring. And then, kind of maybe more jarring, BioMarin, which has a gene therapy for hemophilia A, long awaited, multiple regulatory delays here in the United States. They won approval in the EU and are yet to dose a commercial patient there because of price negotiations in the EU, which we know can be protracted. But likewise, they won approval in the United States and the FDA finally in June of this year and are yet to have a commercial patient here. So it's, this is just kind of how it is. I guess we're learning now that more gene therapies are getting approved, that this is not like, when a pill wins FDA approval for a major disease and just begins shipping within a week or so. Like, this is a much more complicated process.
Yeah, it's hard sometimes to compare across gene therapies because, obviously we're talking about different diseases and we're talking about different kind of treatment logistics and like, so for instance, you mentioned, the hemophilia gene therapies, which are now out there and approved. But, you sort of have to put that in the context of the fact that there are approved treatments, drugs for hemophilia A and hemophilia B that are, quite effective and patients are on. And so, that's a decision then, whether you're going to sort of stop taking those and have this sort of one-time gene therapy, what's the durability of that gene therapy, the cost, all those kinds of things. So I think, particularly maybe with BioMarin and their hemophilia A gene therapy, those are certainly some of the discussions and some of the challenges that they will face when trying to get patients off of, to basically switch to a gene therapy versus, being treated with existing drugs, which are, quite effective. So I think those are, sort of layer all that on top of all the other logistic challenges and getting insurance companies to pay for this.
To kind of change topics a little bit, I almost feel like a sub theme of this episode could be like then and now, how things have changed over the last year or two. Gene therapies, a year or two, we had a lot of clinical holds. I recall now we're getting commercial sales. A year or two, COVID revenue was, astronomical for Moderna and Pfizer. Big banner time period for both of those companies. How are they doing now?
That was also a very good transition, Allison.
Look, you brought in a professional.
No, it's a great point. And, it's been interesting, the narrative for Pfizer and Moderna, I think most principally, but also to some extent Novavax. But any company that markets a COVID-19 vaccine in the United States, we've known as a world, and then particularly for Wall Street in terms of projecting their revenues, that demand for doses, in this case booster doses of COVID-19 vaccines, was going to plummet from 2021 to 2023 gradually. The debate and all the prognostication was about just what would be like the slope of that downward trajectory. And so we're learning more as we go, but it remains a little bit murky. So this week alone, Pfizer reported their earnings in which their COVID vaccine revenue fell about 80% year over year in the second quarter, which is a very large number, but was pretty much expected. What was alarming was that sales of Paxlovid, their antiviral treatment for COVID-19, fell more than 90%, which is also a big number. But in this case, that was 80% worse than Wall Street had expected. So there was some curiosity as to well, just what does that mean? What will the next few months or next year bring for this company? What does this mean for demand for COVID products? And that kind of segued into Moderna's earnings, which were just Thursday morning. And in fact, Moderna's stock price had fallen on Pfizer's data or on Pfizer's results because the presumption was demand was even softer than thought. However, Moderna reported a smaller than expected loss on slightly better COVID-19 vaccine revenue than Wall Street had expected. Now, again, it's a small number, but either way, and the company raised its full year revenue guidance to $6 billion to $8 billion for the year from $5 billion before, which I think had been deliberately conservative, but either way. So the sky isn't falling necessarily, but it's still an open question as to what this winter will look like. Will the presumed uptick in demand for booster doses in the fall, which we all expect because we expect there to be greater transmission of the virus in the winter. That is something that we've learned historically. Will that boost actually materialize in a way that is material to these companies and their revenues? And what does it mean for 2024? And basically, like, how do we model out the long tail of COVID-19 vaccines, which is integral to Pfizer because even though they're a diversified multinational pharma company, they've made so much money on COVID that, like, CEO Albert Bourla said earlier this week that if COVID revenues dissipate more rapidly than they thought, they may consider cost cuts. Presumably that would mean layoffs. They will change the nature of their business. For Moderna, it's even more vital in that this is their only approved product. And it would be nice if its revenues would persist long enough to kind of bridge to Moderna's next expected products, which the company hopes to win FDA approval for vaccines for RSV next year, and also a vaccine for cytomegalovirus in the near term. And there's a personalized cancer vaccine with Merck that is a little further out. But basically, ideally, the company would have more of a revenue base going into those next products if and when they win approval, whereas if COVID revenue falls off a cliff, it'll be more problematic.
Okay, I don't have a transition from that one.
Yeah.
It's like, let me think of a transition. Now the ante is up. Okay, I'm gonna pitch it over to Adam for another, kind of commercial drug drama that is playing out, has played out over the last couple of weeks that you dug into in a column, and we're kind of keeping an eye on this weekend. Some conflict of interest issues with Apellis Pharmaceuticals. What is the conflict that came up?
Yeah, there's a bunch of little issues that are going on here with Apellis Pharmaceuticals. Maybe we'll start with the headline, which probably is the bigger, most important part of the story. Is just that this is a company that recently received approval for a treatment for an eye disease called geographic atrophy. This is a sort of an age-related form of eye disease. It's a pretty common form of blindness in older folks. And they have the first approved treatment for geographic atrophy. The launch, very strong right out the gate. There's a lot of demand for this. This is a drug that is injected into the eye. But then in July, there were reports of a pretty severe form of eye inflammation, a side effect called retinal occlusive vasculitis that have popped up. About 7 cases of this have appeared since the drug was launched commercially. There were no cases of this side effect. It's called ROV shorthand. There were no ROV cases seen in the clinical trials that Apellis conducted, but once the drug sort of got out there in the broader physician community and was being treated, and thousands of people were being injected with this this side effect showed up, and it's really serious. This is a form of eye inflammation that blocks the blood vessels in the eye and therefore causes people to go blind. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of attention being paid to this, and Apellis' stock price has plummeted. And the rollout of this drug, which again I said was pretty strong right out of the gate, has slowed considerably as doctors have kind of started to reassess the risk benefit of this drug, and it's compounded by the fact that the cause of this ROV side effect is really not known. There's not been a clear explanation for why patients are experiencing this, and I think until Apellis figures that out, there's going to be a cloud over this drug. Allison, you alluded to the conflict of interest, and that's a sort of a side note to this, and it actually got me kind of drawn into the story because there is a pretty interesting and intense competition for geographic atrophy between Apellis, which I said has the only approved drug now, and a company called Iveric Bio, which has a competing treatment currently under review at the FDA. Iveric was recently acquired by Astellas, the Japanese pharma company. The doctor who is the chairman of the safety committee that kind of first flagged these cases of ROV has, when I looked at it, had an undisclosed financial interest and a financial relationship with Iveric, which after we started to inquire about it, he disclosed that relationship. And so, yeah, what's interesting, what I found, and I've been doing a lot of talking to retinal specialists over the last couple of weeks. It's a very small community of people who do these injections, who treat people for these eye diseases. And, there's a lot of money that sloshes around, a lot of industry money sloshes around amongst these physicians, not only from Apellis and Iveric, but, some of the bigger companies you think Regeneron and Novartis, companies who have, blockbuster drugs and treatments that treat eye diseases. And, financial conflicts play a role in sort of and how physicians, which drugs they reach for and how they talk about those drugs. And it's been interesting because there's a lot of kind of dirty laundry out there, and nobody wants to go on the record about it. They all want to talk to me off the record about everything that's going on. But when I ask, say, hey, well, can I quote you? They're like, oh, no, could never do that. So,
isn't this kind of like the odd situation with a lot of different, disease areas and pharmaceutical drug development that, you'll have doctors who, these webs of conflict of interests and payments and, consulting fees for different companies. Like, why do you think it's come up and, wasn't it a topic of conversation at a meeting that was held this last weekend,
right,
kind of in the eye disease arena? Like, why is it, jumping out in this case?
I think, like you said, the fact that physicians and experts consult with drug companies and they make money on those consulting arrangements, all of that's not new, right? We all know that happens. It happens in every disease area. It's very, very common. And, and when physicians or scientists go to medical meetings, you always see that disclosure slide that goes up. It's like the first slide, and they usually either joke about it or the slide kind of goes up for like a millisecond. So it's like so hard to like say, wait a second. Where'd that go? I think
it's like the warnings at the end of every like TV advertisement that are said
exactly.
at like
right
3 times speed.
Exactly right. It's like, oh, here's my disclosures. Whoop, there they go. But I think to answer your question, Alison, and it's a good one. I think it's sort of magnified here because the disclosures here were very murky and some of them were not disclosed properly. So I think that there was, and myself included, sort of raised some issues and some questions about that. And again, I said it's such a small community in this sort of, in the retinal world, in the ocular world, that it's somewhat magnified here. And there's just I think what I'm surprised about is like, maybe not surprised, but there's just so much mudslinging back and forth. About people sort of trash talking. They're trash talking the Apellis drug. They're trash talking Iveric's drug, and you sort of have to filter all of that out through well, who's getting paid by who, right? And so it's been an interesting couple of weeks.
So the forward-looking aspect, as you mentioned, Adam, is that it's incumbent upon Apellis to come up with an explanation for these, albeit rare, but obviously very concerning side effects, and perhaps like a risk mitigation plan to kind of get its launch of this drug back on the rails. I was curious, just reading one of your stories, you pointed out that the rates of ROV seem to be higher in an approved Novartis medicine with a different biological target and that treats a different disease, but that also happens to be injected into the eye. And I was curious, to what extent, or is there speculation on whether this side effect emerging in the real world, not in clinical trials, could have less to do with the like biological effects of this drug and more to do with the like how it's administered and even conceivably like physician error or like training?
Yeah, that's a great question to point, Damon. I'm glad you brought it up because I should have said in the beginning, like I said, there were 7 cases of this side effect that have been detected so far, reported so far, but that's in tens of thousands of injections, right? So the rate of this side effect appearing is really important. It's an important number and something that the community is looking very closely at. And right now, that frequency, that rate of this side effect is very low. I think it's just a little bit over 1 case per 10,000 injections. And that compares to very favorably to some other existing treatments out there, which have a higher rate There's some thinking that there is sort of like this background rate of this ROV that is just going to happen when you, not to be too gross, but when you stick a needle in an eyeball, you are going to unfortunately going to be some of these infections and this inflammation that does occur, and that there is a background rate. What you have to do is what the challenge is sort of parsing the background rate versus what might be an elevated rate due to some other cause factor, which again has not yet been explained. So yeah, I mean, what's been interesting to look watching Apellis is, they've been looking at, well, is there something in the formulation of the drug itself that is causing this? Is it, is there something in the manufacturing process that is causing this? Is there something in the way that patients are prepared or the injections are prepared that is causing this? And these are all factors that they're looking at. They have not found a single cause for these cases yet, but they are still looking. And so, when I talk to analysts about this, yes, they need to come up with some kind of risk mitigation plan that will help people to, again, to mitigate the risk of this and to reduce the rate of this so that physicians become more comfortable.
That does it for another episode of the Readout Loud.
Thank you to Teresa Gaffney for producing this week's episode.
Our senior producers are Hyacinth Empanato and Alyssa Ambrose. Our executive producer is Rick Burke, and our theme music is by Brian Joel.
And we'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you liked about this week's episode, what you didn't like, and which of Allison's stellar transitions was your favorite. You can do all of that by sending us an email at readoutloud@statnews.com.
And if you like what we do, leave a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you use to get your podcasts.
See you next week.